The 12th century steppes of Mongolia were vast, endless, and unforgiving. Harsh winds carried dust across the grasslands, and survival depended on strength, cunning, and loyalty to the clan. Into this brutal world, a boy named Temujin was born, destined to become the man history will call Genghis Khan. From the very beginning, his life was carved by violence. His father was poisoned by rivals when Temujin was still a child, leaving the boy and his family abandoned, starving, and hunted. It was in these years of hunger and betrayal that the seeds of his ruthless ambition first took root. Temujin's early experiences with betrayal hardened him in ways few could imagine. He watched his family reduced to eating roots and small rodents, while neighboring clans ignored their suffering. Trust became a weakness, and vengeance a necessity. By the time he reached adulthood, Temujin had sworn an oath to never allow himself to be powerless again. His resolve was not simply to survive, but to dominate, to bend all who opposed him into submission. Those who betrayed him would be punished not only with death, but with obliteration so complete that their names would vanish from memory. When Temujin began uniting the Mongol tribes under his leadership, he quickly established a reputation for ruthless discipline. Men who disobeyed his orders were executed without hesitation, often in front of their comrades. Entire families of defectors were slaughtered to ensure no seed of rebellion survived. Fear became his sharpest weapon. Those who followed him did so not only out of respect, but out of dread of what would happen if they betrayed him. To his enemies, the stories of his cruelty spread like wildfire rumors of men being boiled alive, women enslaved, and children slaughtered in the thousands. By 1206, Temujin had taken the title of Genghis Khan, universal ruler. With the tribes united, his hunger for conquest turned outward. The Mongol hordes rode like a storm, fast and merciless, leaving ruin in their wake. Their armies were unlike anything the world had seen, disciplined, swift, and absolutely loyal. Cities that resisted faced unimaginable torment. Surrender, however, did not guarantee mercy. At times, entire populations who laid down their arms were still annihilated, their corpses stacked high to serve as warnings to the next city in their path. Fear was the foundation of his empire, and he wielded it with precision. The Khwarezmian Empire, stretching across Persia and Central Asia, became one of Genghis Khan's most infamous targets. In 1218, he sent a caravan of merchants to establish trade with the Khwarezm Shah. Instead of welcoming them, the Shah ordered the traders executed and their goods stolen. To the Mongols, this was more than an insult. It was a declaration of war. Genghis Khan's rage was boundless. He vowed that the Khwarezmian Empire would not only fall, but will be erased from existence, its cities turned into graveyards, and its people reduced to dust. The Mongol retribution was swift and merciless. Town after town fell under their assault, each subjected to horrors that turned blood into rivers. In one city, the defenders were promised mercy if they surrendered. When the gates opened, the Mongols slaughtered nearly the entire population, sparing only a few skilled artisans and children who could be raised as slaves. In another, Genghis ordered every man, woman, and child executed, their bodies piled into pyramids of skulls. Survivors, often spared only to spread the tale, carried with them visions of hell that haunted them until death. It was not only the scale of the massacres that shocked the world, but the methodical cruelty with which they were carried out. Mongol soldiers took pleasure in devising brutal punishments for captives. Nobles were humiliated, stripped of titles, and executed in grotesque fashion, some crushed under heavy boards. Others suffocated with molten silver poured into their throats. Prisoners of war were sometimes used as human shields, tied together and forced to march before the Mongol cavalry into battle, ensuring their deaths served the conquest. To the Khan, such methods were not savagery but strategy. Terror was as much a weapon as the bow and arrow. Entire cities vanished from maps. Nishapur, once a thriving Persian jewel, faced one of the most infamous massacres in history. After a Mongol commander was killed in the fighting, Genghis ordered the city's annihilation. Reports claim over 100,000 inhabitants were slaughtered: men, women, children, even animals. The ground ran red for days, and the cries of the dying echoed long after the flames consumed the ruins. The message was clear: resist, and your people will cease to exist. The Mongols did not merely defeat enemies, they extinguished them. Yet, behind the veil of terror, Genghis Khan saw himself not as a butcher, but as an architect of order. To him, the destruction of cities was the price of empire. His code of laws, the Yasa, demanded loyalty and obedience. And for those who bent the knee, life under Mongol rule could mean safety, even prosperity. But the price of resistance was annihilation, and the line between surrender and survival was always uncertain. Many rulers gambled with mercy, only to find themselves betrayed by the Khan's unpredictable wrath. By the time the Mongols had carved their empire deep into Central Asia, tales of their massacres had spread across continents. From Europe to the Middle East, rulers trembled at the thought of the Khan's riders appearing at their gates. Genghis had weaponized reputation itself, turning rumor and fear into instruments of control. Even cities never touched by Mongol hooves surrendered at the mere whisper of their coming. But for those who resisted, the cost was carved into the earth with blood and fire, their names forever erased by the relentless tide of conquest. Episode 1 closes not with the end of the story, but with the beginning of a storm that would sweep across the world. Genghis Khan, once a starving boy on the steppes, had transformed into a force of destruction unlike any before him. His reign of blood and fear had only just begun, and the shadow of his terror was stretching farther with every passing year. For millions, his name would mean death. For history, it would mean both empire and massacre, forever intertwined in the legacy of the Mongol horde. The fall of the Khwarezmian Empire had sent shockwaves across the Islamic world. By the early 1220s, its lands were nothing more than smoldering ruins. Yet Genghis Khan was not satisfied. His rage against the Shah had turned into a personal crusade, one that would see entire populations reduced to ash. Cities were not merely conquered. They were dismantled brick by brick, their people slaughtered until silence replaced their once bustling markets. For the Mongols, this was not just war, it was the crafting of an empire built on terror. One of the most horrifying massacres came with the destruction of the ancient city of Merv, known as the Queen of the World for its wealth and beauty. Merv was a jewel of Central Asia, but when its gates opened to the Mongols in 1221, Genghis ordered a fate so grim that survivors would whisper of it for centuries. Chroniclers wrote that each Mongol soldier was assigned between 300 and 400 civilians to execute. The slaughter lasted for days, and when it ended, more than 700,000 men, women, and children lay dead. The city's gardens, once lush with life, were choked with corpses. Merv ceased to exist. From Merv, the Mongols moved on to Nishapur once more. This time, the massacre was fueled by vengeance. Genghis Khan's son-in-law had been killed during the siege, and in retaliation, he ordered the entire population exterminated. Reports tell of over 100,000 people slain, though some chroniclers claim the number was closer to 200,000. The Mongols butchered not only the living, but also dug up the dead, ensuring no family lineage remained. Women were dragged into slavery, and children too small for labor were cut down in the streets. The Mongol message was clear strike against them, and your entire bloodline would be erased. Perhaps most terrifying was the systematic efficiency of the massacres. The Mongols did not descend into chaos when killing. They were organized. Families were rounded up, divided into groups, and executed in precise order. Soldiers sometimes used captives as executioners, forcing fathers to kill their own sons before slaughtering them in turn. The psychological torment was as devastating as the physical destruction. Cities that survived carried scars that lasted generations, the memory of Mongol cruelty etched into their culture and faith. Herat, another gem of Persia, resisted but eventually succumbed. The defenders fought bravely, but when the city fell, Genghis showed no mercy. Chroniclers estimated more than 1.6 million people perished, though modern historians believe the number closer to 100,000. Still, the scale of death was unfathomable. Entire neighborhoods were burned, temples reduced to rubble, and rivers clogged with bodies. Mongol horsemen rode through the ruins with torches, setting fire to what little remained. The smell of burning flesh lingered for weeks, long after the flames had died. Beyond Persia, Genghis turned his gaze to Eastern Europe. The Mongol horde, numbering in the tens of thousands, advanced with speed and brutality. In 1223, at the Battle of the Khalkha River, they crushed a coalition of Russian princes. But victory was not enough. To send a message, they captured 70 noblemen and executed them in a gruesome spectacle. The princes were laid on the ground, covered with wooden planks, and Mongol generals feasted atop them, crushing them slowly under their weight. Death came not by sword, but by suffocation and humiliation. The cruelty was deliberate, a theater of terror designed to break the will of nations. Cities that resisted, the Mongols learned that surrender often led to survival, but resistance invited annihilation. Yet, even surrender did not always guarantee life. In Bukhara, the gates were open, and Genghis himself entered the city mosque. Standing before the trembling faithful, he declared, "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." Then the city was plundered, its treasures stripped, and thousands executed. For survivors, those words would echo for generations, a chilling reminder of the devastation that followed the Mongol shadow. The massacres spread like wildfire. In Urgench, resistance was fierce, but when the city finally fell, the retribution was unparalleled. The Mongols killed so many people that they struggled to dispose of the bodies. Some chronicles claim that nearly 1.2 million died in Urgench alone, though modern estimates are lower. Still, the streets ran with blood, and pyramids of severed heads decorated the dates. Skilled artisans were spared only to be deported to Mongolia, where they lived under constant watch, while the rest of the population was wiped from existence. What made the Mongol terror so unique was its scale combined with its swiftness. Other conquerors throughout history had killed, but few had turned massacre into a calculated tool of war. Genghis Khan understood that a reputation for cruelty was as powerful as any army. Word traveled faster than the Mongol horses, and by the time his armies reached new territories, entire cities sometimes surrendered without a fight, choosing submission over obliteration. The Khan had weaponized fear itself, ensuring that many battles were won before they even began. Yet not all bowed quietly. Some rulers gambled, believing their defenses would hold, but each time the Mongols proved unstoppable. Castles crumbled, walls were breached, and fields were burned. Survivors of one massacre were often forced to carry messages of doom to neighboring lands, spreading the legend of Mongol terror farther and faster than any scout. In this way, terror became an echo, rolling across Asia and Europe like thunder before a storm. By the time the storm arrived, cities had already broken under the weight of fear. By the mid-1220s, the Mongol Empire stretched farther than any before it, carved not only with steel, but with blood. Millions had died, and countless cities had been erased from history. Yet Genghis Khan was not finished. His eyes now turned westward, toward the lands of Russia, Poland, and eventually the heart of Europe. The massacres of Persia and Central Asia had been only the beginning of rehearsal for the terror that would soon consume half the known world. Episode 2 closes with the Khan at the height of his power, his armies undefeated, his name spoken in whispers across continents. To resist him was to die. To surrender was to live under the shadow of fear. The world had never seen such cruelty woven so tightly with conquest. And as the Mongol hordes pressed onward, rivers of fire and bones marked their path. The reign of blood was far from over, and darker massacres still awaited. By the 1230s, Genghis Khan was dead, but his empire lived on, carried forward by his sons and generals with the same unrelenting brutality. The world had not been granted peace with the Khan's passing. Instead, his legacy of terror intensified. His successors Gedai, Beta, Subota expanded the Mongol tide farther west, into Russia, Poland, Hungary, and the heart of Europe. For the people of these lands, the Mongol name came like a curse, whispered in fear. What had happened in Persia now began to unfold on European soil. The first to feel the wrath were the Russian principalities. The Mongols descended upon Ryazan in 1237, demanding tribute. When the people refused, the horde unleashed destruction that stunned even hardened warriors. For 5 days the city burned, and nearly its entire population was exterminated. Men were hacked apart in the streets, women were taken and then killed, and children were cut down without hesitation. Chroniclers wrote that not a single house was left standing, only ashes and silence. Those who survived were taken as slaves, their chains a reminder of Mongol mercy's rarity. Moscow, then a small settlement, fell soon after, followed by Vladimir. In Vladimir, the Grand Prince's family fled into the cathedral, praying for divine intervention. But the Mongols showed no respect for holy ground. They stormed the church, slaughtered everyone inside, and set the building aflame. Smoke rose from the ruins of what had once been sacred, and the Mongols moved on, leaving behind nothing but corpses. Faith itself seemed powerless against the tide of destruction, and whispers spread that perhaps the Mongols truly were the punishment of God. In 1240, the Mongols turned to Kiev, the jewel of Rus. The city was proud, ancient, and defiant, but it could not withstand the Mongol fury. When the walls fell, the massacre was total. Chronicles describe streets paved with bodies, homes filled with the dead, and churches toppled into ruins. The Dnieper River ran red with blood, carrying corpses downstream like driftwood. So complete was the destruction that Kiev, once the thriving heart of Eastern Europe, would take centuries to recover. The Mongols had not only conquered it, they had erased its glory. From Russia, the Mongol armies pushed into Poland and Hungary. At the Battle of Legnica in 1241, a coalition of European knights clashed with the Mongol horde. The knights, armored and proud, fought bravely, but were hopelessly outmatched by Mongol strategy. The battle ended with the slaughter of thousands. The Mongols piled the severed ears of their victims into great mounds, a grotesque monument to their victory. Meanwhile, Hungarian fields were ravaged, villages burned, and entire populations exterminated. Survivors wandered as refugees, haunted by the smoke rising from their homes. What made these massacres especially terrifying was their swiftness. Unlike sieges that dragged on for months in Europe, the Mongols moved with lightning speed. They appeared suddenly, destroyed everything in their path, and vanished like ghosts. This unpredictability spread terror beyond the reach of their arrows. In towns untouched by the horde, bells tolled in panic, and peasants fled at the mere rumor of horsemen on the horizon. Whole regions surrendered without a fight, not out of weakness, but out of fear of the total annihilation that resistance promised. The cruelty was not confined to battlefields. Captured nobles and rulers were executed in ways designed to humiliate. Some were wrapped in carpets and trampled under horses' hooves, their screams muffled until silence returned. Others were paraded before their people, tortured, and killed slowly to break morale. Women of noble blood were enslaved or given as trophies to Mongol officers, while peasants were slaughtered in mass executions. To the Mongols, killing was not just punishment, but performance, a theater of horror meant to echo for generations. As the Mongol armies reached the edges of Europe, panic spread across Christendom. Chroniclers and monasteries wrote feverishly of the approaching terror, calling the Mongols demons or heralds of the apocalypse. Some believed they were the biblical forces of Gog and Magog, unleashed to destroy the world before Judgment Day. The massacres in Hungary and Poland only confirmed these fears. Villages were left abandoned, their fields untended, their churches empty. Survivors carried tales of entire families, butchered and rivers clogged with human remains. The shadow of fear stretched farther than the hooves of the horses themselves. Yet even as Europe braced for annihilation, fate intervened. In 1242, news reached the Mongol army that Genghis Khan, Genghis' son and the Great Khan, had died in Karakoram. By Mongol custom, the princes were required to return home to elect a new ruler. Just as suddenly as they had arrived, the Mongols withdrew. Europe was spared not by its own strength, but by the demands of Mongol succession. But the reprieve brought little comfort, for the scars of massacre remained, etched deep into the lands they had devastated. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, Mongol cruelty continued unchecked. Baghdad, the center of the Islamic world, would later fall in 1258 under Genghis' grandson Hulagu. Though beyond Genghis' lifetime, it was his legacy of terror that shaped the event. The city's libraries, among the greatest in the world, were burned, their books tossed into the Tigris River until the waters ran black with ink and red with blood. Over 200,000 people were slaughtered in a single week, and the city that had once been the jewel of Islam was reduced to rubble and silence. The Mongol reign of blood was unlike any other in history, not just for its scale but for its philosophy. For Genghis Khan and his heirs, fear was as vital as the sword. By massacring millions, they ensured that future conquests required less effort. Entire kingdoms submitted without resistance, choosing tribute over annihilation. And so, the cycle of terror continued, massacre begetting submission, submission begetting empire. The world bent under the weight of their cruelty, reshaped by blood and fire. By the time the Mongol Empire reached its peak, nearly a quarter of the world's population lived under its rule. Yet, for the tens of millions who perished, their stories ended in silent cities turned to graveyards, cultures extinguished, and families erased. The Mongols had carved the largest contiguous empire in history, but its foundation was built on rivers of blood and mountains of bones. The reign of Genghis Khan and his successors left behind not only an empire but a warning. Power can be born from cruelty, and fear can conquer as effectively as armies. But the cost is immeasurable. For centuries, the lands they destroyed bore the scars of fire and massacre, and the memory of their terror was passed from one generation to the next. The Mongol massacres were not forgotten. They became a legend, a nightmare that history itself could not bury. Thanks for watching.